A very warm welcome to everyone who's here with us. For those of you who are not familiar with Anveshan, we are a forum of academicians, researchers, journalists, and activists who share a commitment to the idea of social transformation. We've been active for many years, and ever since the onset of the pandemic, we've regularly been organizing online talks and discussions around the economic, social, and political topics of contemporary relevance to a progressive idea of change. For those of you who wish to know more about Anveshan, uh, please feel free to contact us. I'll share our email ID in the chat box, and please feel free to contact us. So, in the last couple of months, we've been witness to a growing clamor, both nationally and internationally, over the access to vaccines for the COVID-19 pandemic. And the unequal access to vaccines, both within a country and internationally across nations, has been a matter of great concern. But most importantly, what the recent turn of events has highlighted is that in a capitalist society where one's health constitutes an avenue for profit making by capital, the access to vaccines is not a matter to be studied in isolation, but instead must be understood against a specific political economy context, both in terms of production of vaccines and in terms of distribution of vaccines. And I think today's session intends to do just that. So without taking more time, I'll just introduce the speakers. We have with us Professor R. Ramakumar, who is a professor of at the School of Development Studies at Tata Institute of Social Sciences. And the second speaker is Jyotsna Singh, who's a health reporter, and she's also associated with the People's Health Movement. So each speaker will speak for about 20-25 minutes, and then we'll take up the questions from the audience. So meanwhile, you can keep putting your questions in the chat box, but I'd request the audience to please keep their audio muted. So I think Professor Ramakumar will go second and Jyotsna will go first. So Jyotsna, over to you.
Thank you, Pranav, and thank you, Anveshan, for organizing this very important and much needed discussion. Vaccines, when we talk about, vaccines is basically a part of a larger gambit of pro-people public healthcare as we know it. These are not the only important tools, but also other medical products, things like ventilators, medicines, treatments. And as we know that vaccines are actually not preventing the disease, they prevent the severity of the disease in case of COVID-19. So we will be needing those other medical tools constantly and for a long time to come. Masks, for example, are going to be needed for a long time, as we know. There is larger public health response to a pandemic like this. So, for example, what do we do about lockdowns? How should they go about? What are the economic policies to be followed so that the suffering on the people is not so much? It can be minimized as much as possible. Even within vaccines, how to prioritize vulnerable populations and to ensure that there is equitable access to vaccines. So all of these are also very much part of that larger framework. But at the same time, vaccines have become very important because in the last 1.5 years, the kind of buildup that we have seen around vaccines and the kind of promises that have been made, efforts that have been made, or we are told that efforts have been made and are being made to make vaccines accessible and available to everyone on earth. What has happened to those efforts? So it is really prudent to analyze that because we know that those efforts have failed miserably. Vaccine inequity has actually come to define the global vaccine response. It is not accessibility that defines that response. So why has that happened? And there is a political context, an economic context within which this has happened. So it would be good to analyze that. It would be good to see what can be the possible solutions. And very excitingly, some of those solutions are now being put in place, are being implemented at the global level, international level, led by none other than Cuba, an island country which is 90 miles from the USA and has been challenging the monopoly regime which is led by the USA. So more or less, this is something which I will talk about. But just to build the context for this kind of under the leadership of Cuba, the kind of South-South solidarity that has emerged in the last 10, 15 days is something which I'll speak, but what is the context in which that has happened? That is, I'll just touch briefly upon those points as well. So it was in last year in February that the genome sequence of the virus had been put in the public domain, which meant that any scientist in the world, any company in the world, any research institute in the world had access digitally to the whole sequence of virus, which could help them in developing vaccines, medicines, and other kinds of responses. And so that really accelerated research and development. But then the solidarity stopped there. After that, everything that was done was a complete secret, a complete monopoly of certain companies and institutes. So whether we talk about Pfizer or Johnson and Johnson, AstraZeneca, in fact, AstraZeneca has been such a betrayal. The Jenner Institute of Oxford, it had said when it started researching, and when people realized that it has a promising vaccine candidate, they said they will go for open licensing, which meant any manufacturer in the world will have access to the vaccine and they will be able to manufacture it. But then Bill and Melinda Gates entered the scene, and it is widely reported that since then, Jenner Institute could not put it in the public domain, and there was an exclusive licensing with AstraZeneca, which further entered into an exclusive license with Serum Institute of India, which means that in India, no company other than SII can manufacture it. So this is what we had seen as far as the response of certain companies based in the West, in the global North. They responded to the production of vaccines. And let us not forget, we are talking about vaccinating 7 billion plus people on this earth. And if vaccine doses are 2 or 3, then that much more. No one company, not few companies, not few factories can produce those many vaccines. We need a lot more manufacturing and production. And with the kind of monopoly that these companies have, patents that they have entered into, or secret deals, bilateral deals with certain countries where we do not even know what is the price, and when they talk about license, what are the terms of license, in absolute secrecy, all of this is happening. And it is happening worse that because a lot of research has actually happened in the public sector institutes. India's example, Bharat Biotech's vaccine, Covaxin, Make in India, right? It was actually the ICMR, the Indian government's institute was involved in it, and there's complete monopoly. It is on that vaccine as well. They're entering into licenses now, but as we know, it's already too late, ain't it? We have lost a lot of lives. So this is what has happened with regard to the companies. Now, there was an initiative by the World Health Organization, an ACT accelerator, that was a program that initiative that they came up with, which would ensure that there is, and not ensure, they said that if companies want, they can pool their technology, which will be available to other manufacturers. They have one pillar of this is of vaccine pillar, which is called COVAX. So COVAX pillar was supposed to has mainly 2 elements. One, the funding would come from the rich countries to that pillar, and a certain amount of vaccines will go to the third world free of cost. And the companies will, if they want, again, it is a voluntary mechanism, they can pool in their technology so that other companies in the third world can manufacture those vaccines. Not even one company has given its technology in COVAX. It is a complete failure, a complete failure. So other companies and manufacturers cannot manufacture those vaccines. What they promised in terms of free vaccines, 20% of the population of the developing countries was supposed to get vaccines free of cost from COVAX, 20%. Like, what would happen to the rest of the 80%? And as I will just show a slide, and what has happened to that 20% is another story. It has just not happened. We are lurking somewhere, like some country has got 1%, vaccine to be able to vaccinate only 1% of its population. Some countries lesser than that. So it is the kind of shamelessness that we have seen by these companies, by the rich countries of the global North, is phenomenal. Knowing that all of this will happen, it was in October last year that the Indian and the South African government, they asked in the World Trade Organization to waive off any kind of intellectual property on COVID-19 products, which would mean patents, of course, but also copyrights, trade secrets, technological know-how, anything and everything to do with monopoly over technology or the products which come out of that technology. But what the negotiations on that started just a month ago, because the rich countries, the entire West, completely blocked that proposal. Within a few weeks of the proposal being placed by the two governments, within a few weeks, more than 100 developing countries came to support it. They said, we need it. We can't let our people die. And then you had these mainly Europe, US, Canada, Japan, Australia, and certain other countries which blocked that proposal. They were in minority, but then WTO rules are such that they could actually override the majority opinion. So the Western model, the global North model, has actually failed us. They kept promising things and they have not met those promises, and those promises were in any case less than bare minimum. And what it has meant, I'll just show this slide to give a sense of the shamelessness of inequity that we can talk about. Yeah. So this is the screenshot from today from our World in Data, which have been collecting the data. Look, and this is for vaccination. So this shows people who have been vaccinated at least once in a country. United States has been able to vaccinate 65% of its population. European Union, 55. Look at Mexico, 22.
Jyotsna,
Yeah.
we can see only. I can see only a wide screen.
Okay.
No figure is visible if you're actually showing one.
Okay, I'm sorry. Wait. Now, again.
No.
No. Wait. And not now either, is it?
No.
Okay.
You'll probably have to stop sharing your screen and then try again.
Okay, I'll just do that. And I'll stop my video also maybe. Let me try. Is it visible now?
Yes, visible now.
Oh,
yes.
Fine. Yeah, so this shows, so United States is at 65%, European Union 55%, Mexico 22%, Bolivia something like 15%. African nations are among the worst affected. South Africa, which has a very good public healthcare system, otherwise they have mechanisms to deliver vaccines if they want to, and even they do not have access. Democratic Republic of Congo, 0.05% people vaccinated till now. 0.05%. That is not even 0.5% of their population. And DRC happens to be one of the countries which has maximum natural resources, leading producer of natural diamonds in the world and whatnot. And this is what we've done with these countries. So this is a level of shamelessness. And there are certain countries which have been affected because of US imperialism. For example, Venezuela, Iran, and Cuba, because of the US sanctions, these countries did not have access to a lot of vaccines. And that actually forced Cuba, well, Cuba has been facing blockade since 1962, so it wasn't a new thing for them, but Cuba could start vaccinating only from mid-May. 10th or 11th of May, they could start vaccination. When in the rest of the world, it actually, or not the rest of the world, in the global north, vaccination had started in December or early January. And they could do it only because they came up with their own vaccine candidates. And the success story, of course, is that now Cuba already is at 24%, higher than many other countries. So this is what inequality looks like in today's world, for a pandemic about which everybody is talking, which is, it is like for the first time, health is on the front pages every single day for 1.5 years. But when it comes to inequality, that's where we stand. And as I showed that Cuba has come up with its candidates, it is no joke. And Cuba has promised that it is not going to use it only for its own population. In fact, their aim is that they should be able to vaccinate their entire population by the end of this year. They have promised that they are going to supply these vaccines across the world. They will give the technology to whosoever wants it. They are not going to impose their patents in the fashion that the global north has done it. And that is why Cuba is the country which is leading as I began by saying, the South-South solidarity that has come together. Cuba is the leader in that. But just to talk about what are these Cuba's vaccines, because that has set the stage for something like, I mean, we believe that what has happened in the last 15, 20 days can be a game changer when it comes to vaccine inequality. We can actually attain vaccine equity. It is no more a dream. It can be achieved. And that what Cuba has done for that. So Cuba has 5 vaccine candidates. The technology platform they have used is protein subunit. The importance of this platform is traditionally it is something which has been found to be safe for the populations in general. And it is a very easy platform. It is an old technology. So very easily to be adapted by factories in other countries as well. So which is very important, which means in short, it is scalable. So if the Cuban vaccines are approved, the results for 2 of the vaccines came out just a couple of weeks ago, and their efficacy levels are fantastic. One of the vaccines has 92% of efficacy, which is almost in the range of mRNA vaccines of Pfizer and others. The other with 2 doses has 62% of efficacy, and it's a 3-dose vaccine. So let's see how it comes about. But in any case, according to WHO, any vaccine which has more than 50% of efficacy will be approved. That is the limit for WHO. So these vaccines, they are scalable. You have technology in a lot of countries across the world. So that is one major thing. And all 5 are protein subunit. Then a very important part is that how were these, okay, also to mention, all the vaccines that have so far been approved or have been given emergency use, there are non-protein subunit vaccines among them. It is only Novavax, a company of an American company, which has its vaccine in the 3rd phase of protein subunit. So using this technology and coming up with so many vaccine candidates and 2 already in phase 3, this is a huge achievement by a country using protein subunit technology. So that is really important. But the point is, why was Cuba able to do it? Cuba, the very way Cuba has functioned since 1960s and 70s after the revolution of 1959, their idea of research and scientific discovery is collaboration, which may sound like something obvious that, yeah, that's how research should happen. You collaborate among each other, but that is not how the science is done in the world. If you look at the US and those companies, every research that is being done is a trade secret. The company does not let out anything, and that's not just the companies, even the institutes, government institutes, they do the entire research very secretively, ensuring that they finally get the monopoly of that product, and they have and they use it accordingly, the way they want it. That's not how it happens in Cuba. So from the very beginning, there are 2 Cuban institutes, both government institutes, Finlay and CIGB, which were producing these vaccines, which were researching on these vaccines, and their scientists had these weekly meetings. So the importance also is, if there is a challenge that you face in vaccine making, and you are able to find the solution, the other institute and other scientists don't have to go through the entire process again. They already know the solution. So it is obvious that you move faster, and so Cuba did move faster, and they have these vaccines already available. So that is this, and the idea of collaboration, as we know, is essentially antithetical to monopoly, which is when you have so many institutes involved, you have the government involved, you have scientists. There is an Italian scientist who was also involved with the research of these vaccines. There is no point of monopoly because there are so many people who are already engaging with it. So this collaboration and cooperation in doing science is very important, that it's not just philosophically important, it produces results of this sort, where Cuba has actually given open license of its vaccine. So that was so these are about all the vaccines. The two vaccines, Soberana 2 and Abdallah, are already have finished phase 3 and very promising results. The third vaccine is Mambisa, which is in phase 2 clinical trial. And it's an intranasal vaccine, which is, it does not require injection. It can be put in the nose, a couple of drops, and it is a one-shot vaccine. This is very, very important because then you do not need expertise to administer the vaccine. You can go for door-to-door campaign with this vaccine. So low resource settings, this is going to be the vaccine that they can use. Thirdly, Soberana 2, the one which has already shown promising results, it uses one more technological thing which is called conjugate. So it's a mix of protein and conjugate, which means, and conjugate has a history of being very safe for children. So it is going to be a very promising candidate for children as well. And they have already started pediatric clinical trials. So children as young as 3 years old will be able to actually take this vaccine if the clinical trials go correct. And so far, again, the results are quite interesting. So one country with two institutes working on it has been able to come up with 5 candidates which have their own advantages. And it's important because nobody else has something of this range in their kitty. And the kind of thought process that has gone into it, that it has to be scalable, that children have to be taken care of, that low resource settings have to be taken care of. These are certain things which are very exciting, and somewhere you start to thank Cuba for being there for us. And of course, I don't have to go into the history, but the history started after the Cuban Revolution, and in 1970s, the way they started to build their biotechnology, that has gone into making these vaccines the way they are. So what has happened is that, and also let's not forget the US blockade since 1962. What does that mean? It means that Cuba is not able to trade into some very essential products with other countries, especially obviously US, but also many European countries. And even if it has access to some of those products, good quality raw material, agents, state-of-the-art technology, if they have, it is very, very expensive for them. They do not have access to a lot of medical products that is required. For example, so Vijay Prashad, he is an American academic. He recently wrote, so last year when the pandemic was on a rise, Cuba did not have ventilators. It could not get ventilators from Europe because they would not give it to Cuba. Now Cuba has come up with its own ventilators, but people could lose lives, have lost lives because of that. Cuba does not have syringes today. It has lack of syringes because every syringe making company in the world who Cuba can have trade with is somewhere linked to the US, including one Indian company, either US market or the US government or financed from the US. So the country does not have syringe. There is a campaign going on right now to collect money for Cuba and send them syringes from here. This is what a country which has been going through because of the imperialist blockade of US has been able to come up with 5 vaccines, which are going to be really important for the developing countries. So that's where we are. And riding on this amazing success of Cuba. From 18th June till 21st June, progressive governments, manufacturers, many other political leaders, including the government of Kerala, they all came together for 4 days. And it was called the Summit for Vaccine Internationalism. And I think vaccine internationalism because they were not only challenging vaccine nationalism, and just to give a context of vaccine nationalism, that US actually has hoarded a lot of vaccines. It has 483% more vaccine than it needs for its entire population. It can vaccinate its population 4 times over, or 2 times over, 2 doses. While DRC, as we saw, cannot go for even 1% of vaccination. So Summit for Vaccine Internationalism, also, I guess, against the idea of globalization, which is essentially the way imperialism works. That summit happened. It was organized by Progressive International. It is, again, a group which has many progressive people, Noam Chomsky, Naomi Klein, and many others in it who are leading these efforts to see to it that we have equity in the world. And the summit happened. Very interesting. And probably it could happen because now we have these products in hand which can be scaled up, the vaccines from Cuba, 2 at least. And then there is one candidate from Mexico, Petria, which should be available by the end of this year. And Cuba and Mexico have already pledged that they will give these vaccines, whosoever wants it, they can give, as I said, they are openly licensed. So these vaccines have become a pivot around which the South-South solidarity is happening, to see to it that everybody is vaccinated, that everybody has, I mean, we talk about access to medicines, I will say access to life. That's what it has come down to. So the summit came up with 5 main agreements. There are 5 principles on which they are working. One is open licensing, where Cuba and Mexico have pledged. Also, it is important that there are so many other countries who also have their research units and all, but it is only these countries which have been able to come up with actually some tangible products, right? The other principle they have agreed upon is solidarity pricing, which means giving these medicines, these vaccines, to countries according to their purchasing power. So it will be cheaper for certain African nations, maybe countries which can afford more will have to be. So they are figuring out that kind of a solidarity pricing for these vaccines. Pooling manufacturing. So Argentina, Venezuela, and Mexico have huge manufacturing capacities for vaccines. They have agreed that they will produce these vaccines, and not only for their own populations, but will enter into agreements and give it to the other countries as well. Pooling of regulatory capacity is the 4th principle. Now, this is very important because if I want a vaccine to be available in my country, it has to I need to have data to be able to see whether I can give regulatory approval or not. And a lot of countries do not have that capacity. So, for example, what Mexico has done already is Paraguay wanted to buy Covaxin from India, but they could not figure out the regulatory approval. Mexico extended its regulatory capacity to do that work for Paraguay, even though Mexico was not going to buy Covaxin. So it actually extended its regulatory support to a country without wanting to buy that vaccine. So Argentina and Mexico have very good regulatory capacities. They have said that in this entire summit, all the governments who participated, if they want, they agree to provide that regulatory support, which is, as I said, very important. Argentina is already helping Ecuador, Paraguay, Mexico for Sputnik vaccine for this purpose. The 5th principle is collective disobedience to big pharma's monopoly. This came from Bolivia, very important, and which actually means that they are saying that the countries will, they are requesting the governments to issue compulsory licenses to the important vaccines so that their own companies can produce these vaccines, which is really, really important. Also, I would like to mention, like if you, those who attended the summit I wrote about it, so I was reading up also. It was, what came through also is that it is not just the governments, I mean, just the developing countries, but the inequity which exists within the countries is also to be looked at. So the MP from Canada, Nikki Ashton, she is a member of parliament. So in her province, there are 70% of the COVID cases were from the indigenous population, though only 30% of the population of her state is indigenous. So the kind of inequity that exists within this, and these populations actually got the vaccines and other products much delayed. They did not get it the way other populations within their country were getting. So that the inequalities within a country and how it goes on to impact, which I think about India, Ramakumar will cover, is also something that this solidarity is trying to address. And if I come to Kerala, very important, Kerala is a part of this, Kerala government is a part of this alliance that is being formed. The government has already said that they will provide their capacity, the Kerala state drugs manufacturers capacity to producing medicines for countries of this alliance, and it will provide other kind of support also from the Institute of Advanced Virology. And very important. So one of the summit participants, Varsha, she was mentioning that what is the importance of Kerala joining this? And the point is that what Kerala has done in India is something what this entire global South is fighting against the global North, the context in which that fight is happening. So when Pinarayi Vijayan wrote to 11 states regarding vaccines that we cannot be buying vaccines separately, let's do something about it, there has to be central procurement. What was he doing? He was talking about cooperative federalism. And on the other hand, what was the central government doing? By actually asking the states to buy their own vaccines, they created an artificial competition within the country, a state versus a state, to fight for the limited amount of vaccines available. And who did it benefit? Who would it benefit? It would benefit the farmer, right? Because if states are fighting, whosoever gives you more money, you give your vaccine to that state. That entire scheme did not produce results, and for reasons we can have a different talk about. I mean, as I've said, that the production itself is so low because of the monopoly regime that the global North has followed. But the fact remains, this is what the central government, Mr. Modi, tried to do, and how Kerala government, their vision was so different in terms of fighting it. So that is how Kerala has become a natural ally of this alliance. Primarily, there are Latin American and Caribbean countries' governments in it. But also political leaders from across the world, say Jeremy Corbyn, Nikki Ashton, the Canadian MP, as I mentioned, from Kisumu province of Kenya, also their government. But what is expected is, and what the organizers hope, is that the others will also join. The African Union, there are talks going on because Africa is, and the African people are in such a dire state at the moment in terms of vaccination and all kinds of medical facilities for that matter, that they may also join. If that happens, and hopefully that will happen, it will be such a slap on the way global North has functioned in this entire, during the pandemic, the kind of inequity they have in our face that we are seeing. I mean, it is almost like the pandemic started as a global pandemic. But if we look at what is happening today, it has become a southern pandemic, right? Only the southern countries are facing it, which shows the kind of world we live in, and we hope to change it. And Cuba is leading it, so is Kerala. So that's really great. That's where I stop. Thank you.
Thank you, Jyotsna. I'd now like to invite Professor Ramakumar.
Thank you. Thank you, Anveshan, for this invitation to speak on this very important topic. And I also thank Jyotsna for providing a very able and very wide-ranging summary of what's happening around the world and the political economy of those changes that we are seeing. In particular, she mentioned the three wonderful Cuban vaccines which are being developed by the public sector in Cuba, and also which, unlike in the developed capitalist world, where also vaccine development has happened, these vaccines and their technologies are likely to be shared across the developing world. And quite apt it is to say that the three vaccines are named also in a very interesting way. The first vaccine, Abdallah, is named after a patriotic drama by the Cuban independence hero Jose Marti. The second vaccine, Soberana, is a Spanish word that means sovereignty. And Mambisa, the third vaccine, it basically refers to the Cuban guerrillas who fought that bloody war for freedom against the Spanish. So Cuba is not hiding its politics in even naming these vaccines, which is quite inspirational, particularly when we see similar vaccines having been developed with public sector support in the developing world, in the developed world, like United States, United Kingdom, Germany, and so on, but the technologies withheld for private profits. That's the kind of capitalist system that we live in, even in the midst of the pandemic. From here, we should move to the Indian case, which is what I will be talking about over the next 25 minutes or so. Now, let me make an opening statement here, which is that the government of India, with respect to the the experience with vaccination, has failed in its social responsibilities as an enlightened welfare state. It has basically, through its vaccination policies, opened the floodgates for a very vulgar form of predatory capitalism to take over the stage amidst the raging pandemic around us. India's vaccine policy, and that's what I'm going to argue, has thoroughly exposed both the failures of an incompetent state as well as the vagaries of the so-called free market for vaccines. Now, where do we start? The Indian case has to begin by listing out three very important failures of the Indian state over the last 1 year or so. That's the time when we started developing vaccines on our own. The first failure that the government of India made was in terms of not diversifying the vaccine availability in India, the type of vaccines that will be available in India, or let's call it diversifying the vaccine basket in India. Here, it is very important to note that it was politics that ruled over science or reason in deciding the vaccine policy. In January, the government of India gave permission, emergency use approval, to two vaccines, the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, which was renamed Covishield when it is used in India, and Covaxin, the vaccine developed in collaboration between the government of India's ICMR and Bharat Biotech, which is basically an IPR shared between the government and the private sector. So these two vaccines were given emergency use approval in the month of January 2021. The reason why these two vaccines, or rather only these two vaccines, were given approval was clearly political. The government of India wanted to showcase its Atmanirbhar policy, self-reliance, the so-called self-reliance policy, position India and India's prime minister as a kind of a Vishwa Guru, and say to the world, and to sort of display to the world, that India can not just serve itself, but also serve the world with just two made in India vaccines. This political objective was the main driving force behind the decision to give approval to just two vaccines in India, and a rather boastful claim that India has adequate capacities, not just for its own requirements, but also to vaccinate the entire world. This meant also that other vaccines that came for permission were denied emergency use approvals in India. For example, Pfizer came for approval in the month of February and March, but that application was turned down because they were told that they have not conducted local bridging trials in India. But the vaccine that you gave permission the previous month, in January, Covaxin, had not even completed phase 3 trials. In fact, it is now July. Even as we are talking in July, the phase 3 results of Covaxin have not fully come into public domain. Just yesterday, they have produced a reprint or a rather preprint of the phase 3 study. Why were different criteria applied to Pfizer on the one hand and Covaxin on the other? It was clearly political. Take the other case, Sputnik V came for approval in February. That again was turned down, saying that they did not supply immunogenicity data along with their application. But did Covishield or Serum Institute, when it applied for EUA in January the previous month, submit immunogenicity data for that vaccine? No, it had not. In fact, even today, even now as we speak in July, the immunogenicity data of Covishield is not available with the government or in the public domain. So very clearly, different criteria were applied to different vaccines based purely on political considerations. That was the first error that the government of India made in its planning for vaccines. The second important error that they made was in not making adequate at-risk investments in vaccine companies, both for research and development on the one hand and expansion of vaccine capacities or production capacities on the other hand. Across the world, not just the socialist examples that Jyotsna provided, also even developed capitalist countries, United Kingdom, United States, Germany, all of them made large at-risk investments in private vaccine companies, both for R&D and in capacity expansion. About 97% of the funding that went into the development of the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine has come from public sources. The United States gave Moderna Therapeutics about $2.5 billion as grant for developing that vaccine. The German government and European Union gave close to 400 to 500 million euros to BioNTech, which was a subsidiary, which was an associate collaborator of Pfizer in developing that vaccine. None of this happened in India. In India, basically no at-risk investments were made in any vaccine company, public or private, by the government of India, even as we count the numbers today. This was the second important error that they made. The third important error that they made was in not ordering adequate quantities of vaccines in time. A large number of countries, developed and developing, had placed advanced purchase orders for vaccines beginning from June 2020 itself. A country like Bangladesh had placed its order with Serum Institute of India in November of 2020 itself. But the government of India had placed a paltry order that to just of about 6.6 crore doses with the Serum Institute of India and Bharat Biotech only by the middle of January of 2021. By then, most of the capacities were committed, particularly of larger companies like Serum Institute. They were committed part of it for their commercial commitments to AstraZeneca, partly for supply to the COVAX mission of the WHO, and so on. Capacities were already committed to previous orders, and only a limited quantity was available for the government of India. So if you look at the overall vaccine policy of the last 1 year, you will see that these three errors that were made in the early stages of vaccine planning continues to haunt the Indian performance or record in vaccinating in India's population. Even now, India has vaccinated, if you take both the doses, we have not vaccinated more than 4% of the population. Now, if you take one dose, it's slightly higher, about 14 to 15%, but that is far lower than countries like China or countries like United States or Israel or those sort of countries. So very clearly, the performance is very poor. India comes up as a laggard in vaccinating its population. And given the size of its population, given the mobility of Indian population, and given the growing importance of the Delta variant, including the Delta Plus variant that is coming up, India not vaccinating its population in time will certainly have global ramifications, and that's where that's how we have to assess the record of the Indian government in vaccinating its population. It has been a grand failure, if you count it as the performance that you would expect from a welfare state. Now, this sort of a poor planning of vaccines was what was the context behind the acute shortage of vaccines that India began to experience after the 7th of April of 2021. In the first week of April, if you remember, vaccination rates on a daily basis had climbed up to about 50 lakh doses per day. But after 7th April, the averages fell to about 25 to 27 lakh doses per day. That was the average of the second, third, and fourth weeks of April. And by the time we reached May, the average daily vaccination rates had plunged even further to just about 19 lakh doses per day. And it's only in June that you see some kind of an improvement in the daily vaccination rates. So these three errors that we made basically were the proximate reasons for this kind of shortage that emerged in India. How did the government of India react or respond to this shortage in April? It made two moves. First was long overdue. It corrected the mistake that it made in January and February, where it had denied permission to Sputnik, Pfizer vaccines, etc. And it said that we are going to give emergency use approvals to more numbers of foreign vaccines if they are already approved by United States Drug Authority and so on. So that was the first U-turn that the government made, realizing the blunder in its policy. In fact, Mr. V.K. Paul, the Niti Aayog member, was on record inviting Pfizer, Moderna, Sputnik, etc. to come to India. They had already come, but they had denied permission. But now he was saying that we are hoping that they will come to India as soon as possible. So that's one. The second policy correction was rather disastrous. In the name of including more sections of the population, particularly those between 18 to 45 years of age, into the vaccination net, the government of India announced a liberalized vaccine policy on the 19th of April, which was to come into effect from the 1st of May. What did it do? Till then, the government of India was procuring 100% of the vaccines at a regulated rate of roughly 150 rupees per dose from both Serum Institute of India and Bharat Biotech, passing it on to states, which then passed on to its citizens free of cost and on a universal basis, though it was limited in the beginning to those above 45 years of age. The government of India first added all those who are between 18 and 45 years of age into the vaccination net. So to begin with, this was done without making sure that there are enough number of doses available for them, more like announcing demonetization without adequate number of 2,000 rupee notes. Now, here what happened basically was that under the guise of bringing more people into the vaccination net, the government inserted two important changes, which were to completely disrupt the vaccination process in India. The first is that the central government withdrew from its responsibility as a single procurer of vaccines. It said we will procure only 50% of the vaccines, 25% of the vaccines will have to be directly purchased by state governments, and the rest 25% will have to be purchased directly by private hospitals. And along with this was kind of a liberalization of vaccine sales or distribution, and this was accompanied by a deregulation of vaccine prices also. The second 50%, 25 plus 25, was were to be distributed or to be sold to private hospitals and state governments, not at the regulated price of 150 rupees per dose, but at much higher prices, which were 3 to 4 times higher than the earlier rates. This meant that vaccine prices in India quadrupled, or tripled or quadrupled, depending on the vaccine that you're talking about, in just about a week after the 19th of April. Now, this liberalized vaccine policy had two dimensions to it, which are very important to highlight. One is its political economy dimension. The political economy dimension is the following. It was the succumbing of the Indian state to the demand by private manufacturers, duopolistic private manufacturers, for super profits. The private vaccine producers, Serum Institute and Bharat Biotech, were completely unhappy with the regulated price of 150 rupees per dose, even if that provided them a normal profit of 100%. Right? No, that's an irony. There's an irony here. Normal profits are not usually 100%. But even in the case that we are talking about, the cost of production of a vaccine has been estimated to be close to 30 to 80 rupees per dose. So if you're charging 150 rupees per dose, it's clearly giving you 100% profit. This was called normal profit. Now, even if we assume that this was all right, the tripling or quadrupling of prices meant that profit rates climbed up to 2,000 to 4,000% when these companies were selling to private hospitals. Covaxin was being sold at 1,200 rupees per dose to private hospitals, and Covishield at 600 rupees per dose for private hospitals. Now, the political economy dimension of the liberalized vaccine policy was that vaccine companies could now move from normal profits to super profits. The government of India gladly agreed to that kind of a pressure or advocacy or lobbying from the private manufacturers. But there was also a politics to it. The politics to it was that the central government very clearly saw the shortage of vaccines continuing into May and June. And this was read by the ruling establishment as they read a possibility here that the state governments and the public at large would blame the central government for the shortage of vaccines, but the responsibility will be fixed on the union government. It wanted to evade this responsibility or accountability. So the central government limited its role to 50% of the vaccine purchases, and the rest 50% was given to state governments and private hospitals, so that any future shortage of vaccines that might come up in May or June can actually be put on the shoulders of state governments and private hospitals, particularly state governments. You could say that it is because the state governments did not order vaccines in time or in adequate quantities that the vaccine shortage is happening. It is not because of poor planning by the central government. This was the political objective of this liberalized vaccine policy. So very clearly, there were two dimensions to it, an economic aspect to it and a political aspect to it. The central government thought that both these objectives would be served by the liberalized vaccine policy. But by the time the vaccine policy rolled out with effect from May 1st, the disastrous impacts of this liberalized vaccine policy became visible to all. To begin with, state governments which were trying to purchase vaccines directly from vaccine providers or vaccine producers were turned down, were sent back. Pfizer, Moderna, etc., told these governments that we will deal only with the union government and not with state governments. The Serum Institute's head, Adar Poonawalla, unable to manage all the phone calls coming from chief ministers and chief secretaries, flew away to London. Poonawalla became a Londonwala in about a week because he simply did not have vaccines to give to the state governments. Private hospitals tried to procure as many doses as possible, but here again, inequalities were starkly visible. Of all the doses that went to private hospitals or were sold to private hospitals, 50% was usurped by just 9 private, large corporate hospitals based in big metropolitan cities, and not to private hospitals based in semi-urban or rural areas. So very clearly, the unequal impacts of the liberalized vaccine policy were very clearly visible on multiple fronts throughout the month of May. Two things happened in May in parallel to this. One, there was enormous public anger. State governments, particularly the two newly elected state governments in Kerala and Tamil Nadu, came out in open against this vaccine policy, wrote letters to the Prime Minister. The Kerala Chief Minister, Pinarayi Vijayan, wrote letters to 11 other chief ministers trying to build a broad front to argue against the liberalized vaccine policy of the central government. And this basically put enormous amount of pressure on the central government on one hand. On the other hand, the Supreme Court of India intervened in the matter. The Supreme Court of India passed rather harsh strictures or comments on or remarks on the vaccine policy of the central government. It questioned its basis itself in many forms, its constitutionality in many forms, and finally placed an order, put out an interim order where it basically said that the vaccine policy of the central government was prima facie arbitrary and irrational. So there was both political pressure on the central government to course correct and pressure from the Supreme Court also to course correct. As a result, on June 7th, the Prime Minister came on national television and announced yet another change in the vaccine strategy of the government. The Prime Minister said that instead of the 50-25-25 formula, it is moving into a 75-25 formula, whereby the 75% of the purchases would be made now by the central government, while the 25% quota or allocation for the private hospitals would remain intact at the earlier higher prices for these vaccine doses. Now, why was this partial revision of the policy made? Clearly, political pressure and judicial pressure played a role. But why was it not made 100%? Why was the 25% quota retained for private hospitals? The only reason you can think of is to allow these private hospitals, or to allow the private vaccine producers to continue to sell 25% of their sales to these private hospitals, through which they could earn at least a part of the super profits that they had otherwise missed out on. This meant that this 25% of the vaccines in India were essentially reserved for the rich, because the prices were such: 780 rupees per dose for Covishield, 1,380 rupees per dose for Covaxin, were simply unaffordable to anybody below the poverty line for sure, but also people belonging to the lower middle class, particularly because more than one person in the family would have to get vaccinated. This meant that this 25% was essentially a vaccination reservation of vaccines for the rich. This was retained only to allow these private vaccine producers to make super profits on the side. This policy also has been disastrous in many ways, not just because it kept 25% reserved for the rich, but also because this 25% quota kept aside for private hospitals has been used to organize multiple scams, vaccination camp scams across the country. In the city where I live, Mumbai, recently 2,500 people were injected with glucose water, while they thought that they were actually being injected with vaccines. These private vaccination camps that are mushrooming across the country are turning out to be huge scams, fleecing of people in the name of vaccinating maximum numbers of people. All of these are sourced from the 25% quota kept aside for private hospitals. So very clearly, even this 25% quota kept aside for private hospitals needs to be taken out, needs to be disbanded, and all 100% of vaccines should be singly procured by the central government and given to everybody free and universally, if we have to ensure that vaccine remains a global public good, and also the Indian state fulfills its constitutional obligation under Article 21, which is essentially a right to free vaccines, something that can be read from right to life under Article 21, which the Supreme Court has also in some sense underlined implicitly. So very clearly, this is the context in which I try to say that the vaccine policy of India has opened the doors for a very vulgar form of predatory capitalism to take root in the middle of the pandemic. The government of India has completely withdrawn from the responsibilities of what should be for an enlightened welfare state. This is the sad state of affairs in India. What is the future? What does the future look like? The future looks very bleak. It doesn't look like India will be able to vaccinate 100% of its population, 18 plus population, in any time before end of 2023. That is a broad picture that appears to be emerging from the data that is now available. The government of India, on the other hand, has been putting out very unrealistic numbers in the public domain, saying that first it said that about 2 billion doses of vaccines would be available by end of 2021. By the time they gave a second affidavit to the Supreme Court, they themselves brought down that number from about 216 crores, that's about 2 billion, to about 135 crores. That is about 62% of the original claim. So the government of India itself has brought down these estimates, but a closer examination of even this 135 crores that the central government says will be available between August and December are overestimates very clearly, because many of them include vaccines which are still under different stages of clinical trials. They have not been approved yet. Even if they are approved in the next 1 or 2 months, production will not begin. Companies like Zydus Cadila do not have any stockpiles at this point of time. Their capacities are small. It is unclear if they will hit full scale capacities in the initial months itself, or they would only hit full capacities only by November, December, etc. That is very unclear. There is a key failure of the government of India here, which I want to highlight, and I will close my initial comments with that, which is related to Covaxin. As Jyotsna mentioned in her intervention, here is a vaccine where the intellectual property rights are shared between the ICMR and a private company. Yet, for many months, beginning from January, an exclusive license was provided to Bharat Biotech only to produce and sell these vaccines. This was essentially an opportunity given to a private company to profiteer using a public IPR. That is unpardonable in the time of vaccine shortage. After enormous amount of public outrage happened in the media and so on, the government of India very hesitantly allowed 3 public sector companies to produce Covaxin. But the problem is that enormous investments are required in these 3 public sector vaccine companies to repurpose their laboratories and start producing these vaccines, which would mean that they will not be starting production anytime before November or December of 2021. The first supplies can be expected only by early 2022. So basically, the way in which the Indian government has squandered an excellent opportunity of having been the owner of an IPR of a vaccine, yet allowing that vaccine to be used for private profiteering is the saddest part of the story. And that's what makes the vulgar form of predatory capitalism that I mentioned even more vulgar or unpardonable in the middle of the pandemic. Here is a vaccine that could have been used for mass production. All public sector vaccine companies could have been ready from June 2020 itself. Investments could have been made in them to repurpose their laboratories, to expand capacities and so on, so that by now, by April or May of 2021, all these 8 or 9 vaccine companies in the public sector that we have could have been made ready to produce Covaxin, and we would not have faced this kind of shortage of vaccines that we are facing today. Unlike Cuba, which Jyotsna mentioned a little while back, the Indian government did not do that basic did not fulfill that basic responsibility. It allowed the Bharat, in fact, even today, there's only one company selling Covaxin in India, that is Bharat Biotech, a private company. Now, this is the nature of vaccine policy that we have been following. There's also a contradiction here. India and South Africa have jointly moved the WTO to allow for a partial or rather temporary waiver of patents or IPRs on COVID vaccines. Now, if it is making a demand like this in the global domain, what is it doing with a public IPR, which it has in its own pocket in India? It is doing quite the reverse in India by not allowing mass production of that vaccine with a public IPR, allowing private companies to profiteer from it. This contradiction is something that once again brings out the vulgarity of the whole process of vaccine planning and vaccine policy in India. And this is why we are in this kind of a sad state today. So the future is bleak unless the vaccine policy in India is overhauled To begin with, it is recognized as a global public good, recognized as something that should be given freely and universally to all Indian residents. Unless it is recognized that public IPRs should be used for public welfare by mass producing the vaccine in the country, by allowing or by rejuvenating and allowing private vaccine companies, not just private vaccine companies, but also public sector vaccine companies to come into vaccine production and expand production. Unless such an overhaul of the vaccine policy and planning is undertaken, we are unlikely to reach anywhere, any satisfactory level of vaccination, even by the middle of 2022. That's the unfortunate state of affairs in India today. I have completed my 25 minutes a minute back. I should not extend my initial comments, but I'll be very happy to take more questions from here on. What I attempted here was a broad summary of what is happening in India with respect to vaccine planning and policy, its problems and so on. Anything else that I've left out, we can handle in the question answer sessions. Thank you very much, Anveshan.
Thank you, Professor Ramakumar and Jyotsna. We have a couple of questions from the audience. The first question is from Saqib. The question is, I'll read out the question for you. Don't you think that the internationalism has also come under some kind of stress in this pandemic, where there are calls for prioritizing domestic vaccination rather than exporting vaccines to other countries? This is particularly the case with countries like India.
Maybe should I take this?
Go ahead.
Yeah. So yeah, that's true. But see, the context is where we are talking about extreme lack of vaccines, and the whole point is that this could have been avoided from the beginning. As Ramakumar has already pointed out, the way Indian vaccines themselves, if the licenses had been given to more manufacturers rather than exclusive licensing, we would have had more numbers of vaccines already. Number two, if the the American companies and the UK companies, see, we are calling them Pfizer, Johnson & Johnson, AstraZeneca. But remember that they can also be called American or companies or American vaccines or vaccines from UK, because the research was done in public sector essentially. But all those, they also gave exclusive licensing. So the problem essentially is that we are not allowing production of these vaccines at a large scale. And we are not using the technology which can be scaled up. So the problem lies there rather than, so I would not be really for vaccine nationalism in that case, because every global citizen has the right to these vaccines, the kind of pandemic we are going through. So, yeah.
Look, the problem of vaccine nationalism that we are facing today is a situation created by the way of the conduct of vaccine policy across the world. If the vaccines produced in the United Kingdom, United States, and Germany, etc., are made available for mass production across the world, the shortage of vaccines that we see today will not be there. And it is the shortage of vaccines which is pushing countries, quite justifiably so on many occasions, to close its borders for exports and so on. So if there was adequate production of vaccines across the world, this shortage would not have happened, and nationalism would not be manifested in this kind of in this form that we see today. This is exactly what the vaccine companies at the same time want. They precisely want this shortage of vaccines. They precisely want freedom to use the so-called tightness in the vaccine market to charge high prices for their exports. Look at Covaxin. How much are they charging for their exports? $15 per dose is what Covaxin is priced in the export market by Bharat Biotech. Only 5% of that goes to ICMR as royalty. The rest, 95%, is pure profits for Mr. Krishna Ella. So if this is the way in which you are conducting your this is the point about AstraZeneca, which started off as a public vaccine and ended up as a private vaccine. The same thing with Moderna. In fact, this is also something that is associated with vaccine stockpiling. United States simply doesn't use AstraZeneca vaccine, but it is sitting on a huge stockpile of vaccines, and it might give it to Canada, but not to any other developing country or in, African country for that matter. So this kind of, so what the point what I wanted to make here is that it is the shortage of vaccines created by an exclusive conduct of vaccine policy that has set the stage for vaccine nationalism. And this shortage of vaccines is something that vaccine companies in the private sector would love to have, so that that's the springboard from which they would move forward to make super profits through very high prices. So, let's not miss this basic point in these discussions.
There's a related question from Meghna. That's something that I think both of you have mentioned in your talks. While there are a lot of problems and clamor around vaccine nationalism and vaccine imperialism, do you think India is struggling with an additional problem of vaccine federalism? And how do you think that work out in terms of political and economic impact on the state budgets and state macroeconomic balances?
Well, when the liberalized vaccine policy was in place, where the state governments had to make direct purchases of vaccines at higher prices, about 20 to 30% of the health budgets in many states had to be set aside for the purchase of vaccines. Thankfully, thanks to political pressure and Supreme Court's intervention, that 25% quota has been taken up by the central government. So a direct impact on state finances is now unlikely. Except for the purchases that they made in the month of May and the first week of June. The rest is now taken care of by the central government. So that's not there. But what, in terms of vaccine federalism, there is an additional point. What is the ratio, what is the formula that is used by the central government to allocate vaccines to states? We don't know. The central government says you're taking 1, 2, or 3 criteria to decide on which state will get how much. But the experience with the 21st June policy out, that is 21st to 28 June, when the revised 75-25 policy was begun to be implemented, you saw that some states, some BJP-ruled states like Madhya Pradesh, one day they would vaccinate lakhs of people. The second day they would vaccinate 4,000 people. The third day they would vaccinate 10,000 people. And the fourth day they will go back to vaccinating lakhs of people. Why? So there's an enormous amount of ad hocism in what states get from the center in terms of allocations of vaccines. And this primarily means that, again, political considerations have come to play a major role in the allocation of vaccines to states, and no socially desirable criteria are being used. Kerala is a state that has shown enormous abilities to ensure there are no vaccines wasted. In fact, their vaccine wastages are negative. They give 11 to 12 doses from a vial of 10 doses. Right? So this kind of care is ensured by some states, but Kerala is not a great recipient of central government allocations of vaccines. Other states ruled by BJP sometimes get much more allocations compared to Kerala. So it's socially desirable criteria have to be used for allocating vaccines to states if you want true federalism to survive. But that's not what we see. It's narrow political considerations that have defined allocations to states, and that's a very bad thing to have in hand at this time.
Perfect. Another question from Meghna. Could you please share your reflections on the possibilities for a TRIPS waiver, given the impact of finance capital on the stock exchange, which is also likely to spill over into macroeconomic balances and specifically hurting the developing world? And I think the context of this is the collapse on the stock exchange that happened after Biden's positive response towards the waiver. Jyotsna, would you like to take this up?
So I am not an economist and can't give exact answer to this, but what I know is that when we talk about access, and as we saw what is happening with the African countries, they do not have access to vaccines. And a lot of the entire developing world doesn't have that access. And that is primarily due to the monopoly regime of the global north that has been followed. And TRIPS waiver is required to challenge all of that. There was lack of shortages of N95 masks last year, which took away lives of so many healthcare workers, forget about people. And that was because, you know, how many patents you have on N95 masks? 100. N95 mask, that one mask has 100 patents, which are, and these patents are more than 100 actually. Some universities, some paper making company, some other company, they all have patent. And how do you fight that patent regime if you want N95 masks to save your people? So if you want that, you need to have the fight against patents and monopoly in every form. So, and that's what I'm saying. It's not just patents. It's about technological know-how. It's about trade secrets. These companies are sitting on every data possible. And when you do not share data, there's another problem with it, which is you do not, even if you, one of your projects has failed, but you don't put out data in the public domain. It's a problem because somebody else will do the same mistake. So to avoid that, you do need these waivers. You do need to fight against monopolies in every form to save lives, to say the least. Yeah.
Professor, would you like to respond to this question?
No, I largely agree with Jyotsna. Nothing much to add. But the point is that, you know, this process of commodifying knowledge is something that began with the TRIPS agreement, the 90s. And India, as you remember, was not initially ready to sign it in toto. There were protracted discussions that happened. And it was only, I think, in 2003 or so, when the left parties put enormous amount of pressure on the government not to sign on the dotted line on TRIPS. We saved for ourselves special provisions like compulsory licensing in cases of distress, and it's only after ensuring some of these precautionary clauses that we finally ended up signing the TRIPS agreement. But the problem is that TRIPS agreement continues to be a closed agreement, in the sense that what the COVID vaccine experience tells us is that companies would go to any extent to completely enclose any kind of trade secret or technical know-how or any other information that might be related. Because patent applications largely have a section called undisclosed information, and it is these know-hows, patents, and trade secrets are sort of hidden into that section of undisclosed information. So even if you get hold of the complete patent application, you will still not be able to replicate this process. In the case of COVID-19 vaccine, remember, this is extremely important to understand that the argument is raised that even if IPRs are waived, technical know-how does not exist to produce them in other countries. That's partly true, no doubt about it. But this is where, and this is where sort of voluntary sharing of information should also happen from companies. But at the same time, it's also important that this is no field where India, China, South Africa, or Brazil can't do anything without technical know-how. These countries have enormous amount of past experience in developing vaccines, in producing vaccines on a large scale, have a strong biotechnology sector in these countries, and they will be able to quickly manage an increase in production if the IPR regulations allow. If you go to BioNTech's website, there's an interesting entry there in one of the pages. You will see that they make 2 points while basically celebrating their mRNA technology. They basically say that its production is very easy. It's they who are saying it's very easy. They say that RNA can be made from a DNA template in the lab, and that this DNA can be synthesized from an electronic sequence that can be sent across the world just by an email attachment. This is BioNTech itself saying about its own vaccine. And how much time does it take to generate an experimental batch of RNA vaccines? Just takes a week. In case of BioNTech's vaccine. That's one point that they make. The second point that they make is RNA vaccines, mRNA vaccines, do not use a bespoke production process. And so scaling and standardizing can be achieved very quickly. right? So all these advantages exist in these new technologies, including mRNA, where the arguments that are usually put forward that these countries do not have the technical know-how or capacity to make these vaccines, it's all completely wrong. Countries like India, South Africa, China, Russia, Brazil are completely equipped to make or mass produce these vaccines if basic facilities and information are provided to them. But the instincts of profiteering under the TRIPS agreement have prevented this kind of sharing from happening. And this is what actually comes up as this extraordinary inequality that you see in the world, in terms of vaccination. I think only about 0.3% of the vaccine doses have actually gone to the least developed countries, while 80 to 90% have gone to developed countries. The one point that developed countries do not understand, or they will understand, or they will not understand at their own peril, in fact, is that if the world is not safe, they are also not safe. If large continents like Africa, Asia are not vaccinated quickly, more mutant strains of the virus will emerge and they will hit back at the same developed capitalist countries which are now boasting of high vaccination rates. This is something that will or might happen in the form of a third or a fourth or a fifth wave. And unless mass production and mass vaccination of the world population is sought to be achieved at the earliest, such a dangerous sort of a scenario would stare at us by 2022 for sure.
Thank you, Professor. There's another question for you. Do you think the ongoing Schumpeterian arguments favoring a monopoly system of vaccine production for innovation holds true? And that's given the fact that a very high proportion of expenditure actually made by this big pharma is on advertising.
This whole point about innovation being made by private vaccine companies is a bogus argument. Okay, now what is it? Let's start from the basics. Vaccine production and research and development of vaccines is a risky business, no doubt about it. But so are many other industries. Okay, there's nothing so extraordinary about vaccine research and development which makes it any more risky than, say, for example, the airline business or something of that sort. Now, it is true that there are risks in vaccine. You invest about 500 crores in a vaccine development, and it fails the phase 3 trial, and then all the 500 crores goes waste. It's possible, agree. So what has happened across the world? Very few private companies have come forward to invest in this. In fact, when the pandemic started, Anthony Fauci was lamenting that very few vaccine companies have come forward to collaborate with the National Institutes of Health in the United States because of the riskiness in the business. So what have governments across the world done, socialist and capitalist, done to take care of this problem? Governments have de-risked these investment or de-risked these investments of private companies. They have come in and spent enormous amount of money by giving grants to these private vaccine developers, like you saw the British government and the European Union giving money to the Oxford vaccine development, German government giving for BioNTech, or US government giving for Moderna. All these monies are grants. Okay, these grants were paid primarily to de-risk the vaccine production by private players. So they cannot come out and say that we innovated by risking our investments. That's not true. You did not risk anything. You got huge amounts of grants from your governments, and that's how you develop these vaccines. And all this money basically came from taxpayers' money. Taxpayers have shared your risks in this whole process of vaccine development, and you have no right at the end of the vaccine development process to turn around and say, no, this is a private vaccine developed through private innovation or private innovative capabilities and so on. That's completely a wrong argument. It simply has not happened. Okay. In fact, many of these public sector investments in these companies have also failed. Remember that. European Union made a huge investment in a company called Sanofi to develop a vaccine. But that Sanofi vaccine never came up. The Sanofi vaccine development failed. That money sank. But that didn't mean that governments across the world stopped investing in private vaccine companies. They continue to do. And thus you have a basket of vaccines today. But now, once these have been developed with taxpayers' money, these companies are now claiming it as a private product. whereas it is actually a global public good. That's the contradiction that we see today. That's the double standard that you see today on the part of vaccine manufacturers, where they're trying to completely privatize the profits coming out from vaccine development and sale, whereas they were actually developed with taxpayers' money. So all this advertising thing is all the marginal expenditure. Okay, all this that's not what makes the difference. The money that has gone into the basic research and development of the vaccine is and the conduct of the trials. That's the largest investment. Once you have made those huge initial investments, big ticket investments in vaccine research and development, the rest is simply mass production. And in that mass production, costs are infinitesimally small. Okay, that's how in India you see the vaccine cost of production are simply 30 rupees to 80 rupees per dose only in the case of Covishield and Covaxin. Because once you have made that investment, then production on a mass scale is very cheap. Right? So all these arguments that they spent enormous amount of their money on advertising, where have you seen any advertisement for Covishield? Have you seen any advertisement for Covaxin? No. What money are they spending there? Have you seen any Pfizer, Moderna? Where do they spend? Because most of their sales are not in the private market. Most of their sales are to governments, right? So there is absolutely no spending on advertising that is involved here. So invoking Schumpeter and all to make a case for private profiteering is completely off track.
And just to add very briefly, traditionally, the research has always been done in case of these vaccines also, but otherwise as well in the public sector. Private sector picks up these molecules when there is a promising candidate. So innovation and research, that part, it doesn't come at that level. So that is one thing. There is a study of, and the other point is, if the private sector claims that we are spending a lot of money on R&D, we have been asking them, make it public. How much money have you spent on what under different heads? That private sector would never do. They have never done it. And the reason is because they lie about the billions of money that they always claim they have spent on something. And there are studies regarding that. There is a 2011 study which showed the top 10 pharma companies invest whatever money they earned in a particular year. R&D was 11 or to 16% for different companies. That is it. Rest were all profits. And there is Professor Andrew Hill from Liverpool University who does a lot of these calculations. He has done a proper modeling and where he has taken care of every type of investment that goes into making drugs. He's done it for HIV and TB drugs, and now he's working on COVID technologies also. But then he has shown that the pharma's profits are 1,000, 2,000%, in some cases even more than that. So there is no justification to anything of this sort. So it doesn't go in R&D, and that we know for sure. It's a bogus argument. Yeah.
Thank you. Jyotsna, there's a question for you. How do you evaluate the possibility of a global South-South alliance manifesting into a larger world movement against imperialism in the future?
Very much. I mean, I think, of course, can't predict what is happening, but the way the kind of, as I had said, that shamelessness with which things have happened, it has shown us a lot. And people are angry in a lot of parts. If you look at the kind of reports that come about, the kind of protests that are happening across, they are huge. And the South-South alliance, it was attending this summit was a reminder of non-aligned movement. It also draws a lot of experience from ELBA, the Bolivarian Alliance of Latin America, which is an intergovernmental organization of 10 countries from LAC. So they do drive experience from there, and hopefully we can see something. And it is definitely a challenge to this. I mean, just imagine if these vaccines can go to the global South, the amount of market, the kind of market that the North will lose global north, they won't be impervious to it. So it is important. Also, just very briefly, did not mention in my talk, but China has played a very important role in coming to this level, because China has actually given more vaccines in the developing countries when it was required, when the others were not giving. And China has also developed technology and technological know-how. It has transferred to countries like Egypt and many other, for its vaccines, both Sinopharm and Sinovac vaccines. So that is also important. China has played an important role, and it preceded this international summit that happened. So let's not forget that also.
There's another question from Charlotte. If you can take that up, Jyotsna. What are the different phases of vaccine approval under normal situations? What are the parameters to gauge success at each stage? And then what is the efficacy of a vaccine? Why do we need phase 3 trials? I mean, if you can just briefly take this up, because it's not directly related to the theme of today.
So very briefly, you have phase 1 to 3 when we say after the animal trials, when a vaccine's safety has been established, then you go to check how much effective a vaccine is. So phase 1 and 2, basically when they are conducted in human beings. After the animal trials, you come and the sample size is small, and you check for immunogenicity and safety profile, which means the vaccine should not be harmful for the human beings. That is the first 2 trials. And the phase 3 trial basically is a much larger sample. So for Cuban vaccines, for example, it has been in the range of 45,000 people, the phase 3, which tests the efficacy, whether the vaccine is effective on the virus or not. The safety is established before that. So that is there. Emergency approvals are given when the base, in a scientific term, when you have established that at least the vaccine is safe, and it is at initial stages, it is showing some effectiveness against the virus. Then WHO gives emergency approval, saying even before the phase 3 trial data comes out, we can give it to the larger population, because that is the need of the hour. And in ideal situation, you also have phase 4, which is pharmacovigilance, basically, that when in the real world, the vaccine is given, because when you do clinical trials, you ensure certain parameters, no? Who do you give it to? In the real world, those parameters are not followed. So you do need that pharmacovigilance also, how vaccine is given and it is not harming people in general. So that's how it goes about here.
Perfect. So there are 2 more questions. I'll actually club them. The questions are: what opportunity does this moment of health crisis in the capitalist system, where super profits are sponsored by the state, what sort of an opportunity does this offer to the left movement for its revival and to other progressive politics? And also, now that the class conflict and the nature of the state has reached a point of unprecedented exposure, do you think it is capable of rejuvenating the fight for universal healthcare, which has only deteriorated since neoliberalism?
That's a grand question for which I don't think I can provide a grand answer. And I can see why you have kept it to the end. This is something that is a very complex issue, and I don't think I have straight answers or simple answers for this problem. Has the COVID-19 pandemic created new contradictions in the capitalist path of development globally? Yes. But are these contradictions such or so strong enough that they will push the capitalist system to the brink of collapse or a very serious crisis? I'm not sure. I'm not sure as yet, because the capitalist world, the capitalist economies across the world have been very quick to dump all orthodoxies that they had advocated over the last 2 or 3 decades, like fiscal deficit or fiscal conservatism, etc. They have dumped all those orthodoxies, have taken up enormous amount of public debts and spent for their people. The kind of relief packages, economic relief packages that you saw under a leader like Donald Trump continuing under Joe Biden, or look at the relief packages introduced by the right-wing government in United Kingdom. All of them show that capitalism has been very quick to be flexible enough to dump orthodoxies and deal with the situation with all the seriousness. So capitalism has in some sense dealt with the pandemic in a very interesting and special way, which was otherwise not expected from such governments. And that is what this flexibility of capitalist systems is what makes me a little circumspect of these grand claims often made of the impending end of capitalism or collapse of capitalism and so on. I don't think we are quite there as yet. But has it made these contradictions more mature? Has it led to new contradictions emerging? Certainly, yes, no doubt about it. That's number one. Number two, what is the role of the left and progressive movements? That has not changed. The left and progressive movements have their task cut out either way, because their primary role, their primary objective should be and has been to expose the predatory forms of exploitation that capitalism, and presently under the imperialist form, has unleashed across the world to create enormous amount of public opinion, mobilize people against this onslaught of imperialism and resist it, create alternatives and so on. You see that constantly emerging in many Latin American countries. In our own country, Kerala has shown up to be an excellent example of what alternative politics or alternative policy can or should imply. The left has been playing a very important role anyway, and that role should continue in a much stronger sense, in a much more powerful sense in the post-pandemic period. You do see some improvements in public health happening in the wake of the pandemic. We should mobilize ourselves to protect those gains made. Public health has been in the developed capitalist world. If you see in countries like United Kingdom, you have been seeing a defunding of the National Health Service over a long period of time. This has meant that the public sector, which was very strong in those countries, has shown signs of deterioration or not collapse and all, but certainly signs of weaknesses that are emerging. So there, the role of the left is very clearly to consolidate the gains of the interventions made during the pandemic by governments, and to argue for strengthening of the public health systems there. In countries like India, where there was actually never a public health system to boast of in any serious way, the demand of the left has to be to spend at least 3% of the GDP in health, to move away from the disastrous American model of insurance as the solution of public health problems, to ensure that we build on public health sector as the answer to the problems, the problems that we have seen in this country. We never had a public health system of any worth. Our job is to build a public health sector. We have states like Kerala as excellent examples or models which other states can learn from. And here particularly, this expansion of health and health sector, public health sector, will have to be a very important slogan, demand to be put forward by left and progressive movements over the next few years. Currently, as you know, we spend only about 1 to 1.5% of the GDP on health. That's hardly adequate. We need to focus on spending at least 3 to 4%. That should be one of the big demands. This expansion of public health, having more hospitals, having more public health institutions, appointing more doctors, nurses, care staff, etc. All of this will also create enormous employment. So investing in health is not just something that caters to human well-being on a personal level. It is also something that adds to economic well-being at the national level by creating constant multiplier effects in the economy, by generating more demand in the economy also, because large numbers of people can be employed in the public health sector. So there are multiple benefits of investing in health, and this is one reason why even capitalist economies of continental Europe, for example, have been very particular. Scandinavian countries, for example, have been very particular in investing in public health in a big way, and the results are there for everyone to see. India has been far away from any such improvement, and that should constitute one of the very important demands of the left and progressive movements. Coming to the second question, or I'm going to continue my answer and move into the next, that now that class conflict and nature of state has reached a point of unprecedented exposure, has it? I'm not very sure. But assuming that what you're saying is at least partially true, do you think it is capable of rejuvenating the fight for universal healthcare, which has only deteriorated? So you are basically asking, is the left capable of fighting this battle? My answer is it should be, or rather it better be. Right? What has the left done? The left, I think here is where Jyotsna also mentioned it. The example of Kerala is an excellent example of what the state should be doing in the time of a pandemic, both on the health front and on the socio-economic front. Okay, Kerala's chief minister, for example, announced that nobody in Kerala will go hungry during the pandemic and the lockdown, and he met it. And that's one reason why the left is back in power in Kerala with an unprecedented mandate. Never has the left returned to power after ruling for 5 years in the last 50 to 60 years of the state formation. It's the first time that the left has come back. And a lot of the credit has to go to the way the state government dealt with the pandemic in terms of addressing it as a health pandemic and also addressing it as a crisis of livelihoods. This is what made the Kerala model something to watch out for. And that's the left's model. Kerala model is the left's model. And that's something that we all should keep in our minds, spread the word across the country. And that should provide us a great inspiration to put forward slogans of alternative politics, alternative policies in the development front, and particularly so here in the health front.
Jyotsna, any closing comments from you on the question?
No, I mean, Ramakumar has covered everything, but yes, I mean, we are all actors in this. It is not only that who is a political activist out there, whether the change will come or not. We are all actors in that sense. And when it is very clear to us what the socialist and the leftist governments have achieved across the world, in Kerala here and in Latin America. So let us be active and talk about it and ensure that we have a better future. And as in SFI, that's what we used to say, when politics decides your future, decide what your politics should be. We need to take it to the masses. Yeah. Thank you.
Great. That's the perfect way to end today's session. So on behalf of Anveshan, I'd like to thank all of you for being with us today. Apologies for not being able to take up all the questions because we were short on time. And I'd like to thank the speakers, firstly, Professor Ramakumar and Jyotsna, for taking out the time for this valuable session, and to the attendees also for being with us. We hope to see you very soon for our next session, and please feel free to write to us to know more about Anveshan. I'll share the email ID in the chat box. The video for today's session will be uploaded on our YouTube channel, the link for which I've shared in the chat box. So thank you everyone for being with us today. Have a nice weekend.
Thank you.